One of the greatest downfalls of Sega's Master System was the dearth of third-party support in the United States. While the platform had many great games, it was shown up by the deluge of software from Nintendo and its many software developers and publishers, all locked into exclusivity contracts that meant Sega was getting nothing of the kind. Luckily for Sega, during the early days of the Genesis, things turned around and they finally started to see some much needed support from Japanese developers who previously barely touched their systems. In this episode, we will be taking a look at one of their earliest and most prolific supporters, Sunsoft, and the more than 24 games they would release. Sunsoft either developed or published games that covered shoot-'em-ups, platformers, beat-'em-ups, fighting games, and even an adventure game. Some of this software ranks among my favorite games for the system. I hope you guys enjoy Sunsoft and the Sega Genesis. In July of 1990, Sunsoft internally developed and published Batman for the Mega Drive in Japan. It's a side-scrolling action platformer that had you take control of the Caped Crusader and followed the Tim Burton movie loosely for its art assets, stage designs, and boss encounters. Gameplay arms the Dark Knight with punches and kicks, as well as batarangs for long-distance attacks. Batman also has the ability to fire a grappling hook upwards to grab onto higher platforms. These side-scrolling stages were augmented with vehicle-based stages as well. You can take both the Batmobile and Batwing for a spin in this one, and they both have normal and special attacks for you to employ. Perhaps the most surprising element of this one is the fact that it's a mere 4 megabits in size. Often when a 16-bit game was that small, you'd get some pretty anemic sound and visuals. I mean, there were 8-bit games out there that were bigger. Yet Batman here is still a stunner in both audio and visuals. The characters and vehicles animate well, the stages have great detail, and oh my god is the music incredible. Sunsoft wrote their own custom sound driver for this game, and had I worked at Sega back then, I would have marched my lawyers and sound engineers right on over to Sunsoft's offices and secured a license to use that driver in damn near every game I produced from then on. Rarely will you ever hear FM synth at this level, this smooth, and with this much variety. One of the chief complaints against the Genesis sound was the fact that it just didn't sound like real instruments a lot of the times. But what we have in this game utterly negates that. FM synth didn't need to sound like real horns and trumpets, because it had its own unique tone that when harnessed properly, it was nothing short of killer. Batman languished in limbo for a year before it showed up for the Genesis in the United States, thanks to Nintendo's exclusivity contracts. It didn't matter because Batman was an incredible experience and an absolute must-play. In January of 1992, under license from Sega, Sunsoft released the magnificent Super Fantasy Zone. This was a unique entry into the series and not a remake or port, but it does nail all the things that made the original game so much fun. Multi-directional shooting, a store for buying upgrades, and some pretty difficult boss battles await you. It's a gorgeous and great sounding game too. Further evidence that Sunsoft's internal software guys knew how to get the most out of Sega's hardware. Sunsoft didn't just manage to create a game that was close to the original System 16 arcade, they trumped it in every way. This saw a European release the following year, but never had a physical release in the United States. Sunsoft got a hold of the Lemmings license and released it in Japan and North America in November of 1992. Lemmings is a strategy puzzle game that has you trying to save as many of the little green dudes as possible. Each stage provides you a series of platforms to navigate to a predetermined exit. Some platforms are enclosed and need digging to get out, some walls need to be climbed, and some pathways need to be blocked. There are many different skills and actions you can imbue the Lemmings with, and you'll need every single one of them as the game progresses. These little guys will follow each other to their doom otherwise. The visuals and sound are serviceable in an otherwise great game you can play with the entire family. In November of 1992, Sunsoft published Batman: Revenge of the Joker, an action platformer that would mark their first foray into getting an outside studio to completely develop one of their Genesis games. It was handled by Ringler Studios, and man was it a sharp and depressing decline in quality from the last Batman game. The only compliment I can pay this game is that it's colorful and has loads of parallax effects, but outside of that, it sounds poor and has some serious gameplay issues. Batman's attacks are varied but weak, and every damn enemy in the game takes way too much damage to dispatch. There is never a break in the onslaught of things that can damage you, and the gameplay simply isn't strong enough to deal with it before it becomes pure frustration. This game is an unbalanced mess of ideas that does Sunsoft's original Genesis effort no justice at all. It was only released in North America. In December of 1992, Sunsoft published Superman in North America for the Genesis. This was another game developed by an outside studio, but luckily it fares a bit better than Revenge of the Joker. It's a side-scrolling action game that has bright, colorful graphics, and it sounds pretty good as well. The gameplay here does hold it back from greatness, however. Superman is fast and responsive, but lacks the attack range to be effective. His standard punch is short, his special attack isn't much better, and in order to attack above you, you must use your jump, which leaves you utterly defenseless from below and to the sides. You can run and use a jump kick, but the angles are terrible for dealing with fast enemies. This makes you one ineffective Man of Steel. Even once you come to terms with these limited moves and begin to have success, it never feels as fun as it should. It's not terrible, but certainly should have been much better. Sunsoft released Blaster Master 2 in June of 1993, much to the elation of fans of the original NES game. A studio called Software Creations did the honors, and I was so stoked to play it. It's an excellent looking game right off the bat. The detail in both the stages and enemies is as good as it gets on the old Genesis, and the animation nails it as well. You get a few different gameplay perspectives here. First is the side-scrolling areas where you jump and blast enemies as you explore. Within these areas are doorways where you can dismount your vehicle and explore on foot. There are also some overhead areas that you must deal with. It all sounds just like it should, but there are some problems. Enemy placement and their attacks make for one hell of a cheap game. Attacks come from every angle and even off the screen. Hell, you even have respawning enemies sitting on top of ladders waiting for you. This cheapness permeates every facet of the experience, and only those with more patience than me will be able to tolerate it. Sunsoft went to the outside well yet again and teamed with Iguana Entertainment to release Aero the Acrobat, an action platformer starring, well, a bat. With Sonic having runaway success that every company coveted, this was Sunsoft's attempt on cashing in on the mascot craze. It follows the expected pattern associated with these releases in the 16-bit era. Take an animal that is built like a human, give him some jump attacks, and in this case the ability to throw stars you collect, put it in a colorful setting, and bingo, 16-bit mascot platformer. While Aero here won't win any contest for its presentation, it is good enough to not be called ugly, and the gameplay is sound enough to be considered fun at times. My main problem with it is the stage design, which is incredibly abstract and is often little more than narrow pillars that you must navigate upwards. It's okay, but Aero is no Sonic killer. It was never released in Japan. You will not hear me say this often, but Days Before Christmas is a Mega Drive game I've never played before this video. It was released exclusively in Australia in 1994 and was developed by Funcom for Sunsoft. You are Santa Claus himself, trying to rescue your elves and get back your presents so there can actually be a Christmas, but the evil timekeeper is out to stop you. This is another action platformer and I was expecting the worst. You know what though? It wasn't nearly as bad as I was thinking it'd be. It's not a pretty game, but its animation is decent and the sound doesn't make you want to cover your ears. The gameplay is basically little more than just hitting enemies and collecting presents, but considering this was aimed squarely at kids, it's easy enough to pick up and play. Due to the low print runs, this game is crazy expensive, often selling for hundreds of dollars complete. (1994's Bubble and Squeak is another game I had not played before, making it 2 in a single episode. It was originally an Amiga game, but Sunsoft got the rights to do a Mega Drive version and released it in North America and Europe. This is a puzzle platformer that has you playing an Earth-child trying to help your alien buddy Squeak. The gameplay is mostly of the escort variety. Each stage presents obstacles that you must overcome, and you have the option of allowing Squeak to follow you around or making him sit still while you find the way forward. The visuals are solid, presenting colorful stages and excellent animation. This is another game that was much better than I had feared, and certainly not the throwaway title I had always assumed. In May of 1994, Sunsoft and Iguana Entertainment teamed up again for the Pirates of Dark Water. Based on the cartoon of the same name, you get to choose from 3 warriors in your quest for lost swords and treasure. Instead of a port of the beat-em-up the Super Nintendo saw, this is actually an action platformer with some light adventure elements. The stages are huge and sprawling, requiring you to actually find the way out instead of just walking right the entire time. The visuals are well detailed, though they appear dark in tone and color for much of the game. The music, however, is just pure ear torture. They had done okay with Aero the Acrobat, but here it's just your typical Gems throwaway sounding music that makes you wonder, did they even try? In August of 1994, Success developed the Japanese exclusive Panorama Cotton, with Sunsoft publishing it. This takes the classic horizontal shoot-'em-up and turns it into a Space Harrier style game. The screen now scrolls primarily forward, giving it a great sense of 3D at times. Since the Mega Drive had no dedicated hardware for sprite scaling, this engine is entirely software driven, an incredibly impressive display. The music is equally as excellent, and you'll want to turn up that volume a bit as you play. The gameplay is a great mix of speed control, magic use, and screen placement to survive its many enemies and puzzle-like stage dangers. You didn't need an expensive add-on to get the old Mega Drive to do some impressive scaling. You just needed some talented programmers. Sunsoft and Iguana were at it again with Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, a spin-off of Aero the Acrobat that stars one of its enemies. Right off the bat, let me say that I enjoyed this so much more than Aero. This has vastly superior graphics and is more colorful and laden with great backgrounds, and Zero plays better too. He has so many more moves like throwing stars, nunchakus, and varied dashing and flying attacks. The music here is a bit better than Pirates of Dark Water, but again it's really weak. It just doesn't have any real rhythm to enjoy, and is instead just mashed together electronic beeps and blips. Otherwise, this one is pretty good. In January of 1995, Sunsoft and Iguana Entertainment keep the mascot platformers rolling with Aero the Acrobat Part 2. This is a vastly superior game to the first effort. The stages are larger and more open, the gameplay more fluid and fun, and the visuals get a huge boost thanks to brighter colors and more detailed backgrounds. There are a ton more set pieces in this to make the levels more fun to play as well. You are always being tossed around by something, and there are numerous hidden areas to seek out. The sound is even tolerable here. Blizzard Entertainment and Sunsoft came together in January of 1995 to release The Death and Return of Superman, a side-scrolling beat-em-up that starred a few different Men of Steel. I wanted so badly to love this game. I enjoyed the original comic book where Doomsday faded Superman, and thought this would capture that intensity in digital form. I couldn't have been further from the truth. Instead, it left me wondering why Superman is taking damage from things like chainsaws, motorcycles, and street thugs. When I wasn't deep in thought over these mysteries, I started to notice I was fighting the same two enemies for long periods of time. I mean, there is always repetition in these kinds of games, but literally, the same two guys keep coming out for an entire stage. The Supermen also have a complete lack of interesting moves, an utter embarrassment since games like Combo Tribes had been out for 5 years by this point. This one is shallow, lacks any assets to speak of from its presentation, and is only one player, and is just an all-around forgettable experience. In September of 1995, Sunsoft developed Scooby-Doo Mystery with Acclaim publishing it. This takes the form of a point-and-click adventure game, something you didn't see on consoles very often at the time. You get 2 choices of mysteries to try and solve, and the gameplay revolves around seeking out clues to find each responsible party. You move around and explore areas that have fixed camera angles, and then can collect items, talk to people, and check out different parts of the room. The animation is great, the art is fairly faithful to the cartoons, and the story's interesting. The lack of mouse support means playing with a pad can be cumbersome, but I still think this is a decent game. The last game Sunsoft was involved in for the Genesis was released in early 1995, Justice League Task Force. It was a collaboration between Blizzard, Sunsoft, and Acclaim, a 2D fighter very much in the mold of Street Fighter II. I really do not like this game. The gameplay is unbalanced as hell, and the moves each hero possesses is almost completely useless because each fight quickly devolves into close quarters punches and kicks, and mass spammage of projectiles. It plays too fast and the gameplay isn't strong enough to support it, leading to a feeling that you have little control over your character. I didn't mind the visuals with its large characters, but it sounds like absolute dog shit. I mean, did Western developers have ears back then or what? How did you put out games that sounded like this? Why didn't Sunsoft employ its custom sound drivers that had served its early games so well? In the end, we are left with a shallow, poor playing mess with garbage sound. Don't waste your time. Sunsoft also had a handful of other titles I wanted to go over quickly. They were responsible for publishing the adventure classic Flashback in Japan for the Mega Drive. US Gold handled it in other parts of the world. Sunsoft was also part of the trio of companies that did the two Beauty and the Beast games for the Genesis. One was an action game and the other had you exploring and playing mini-games. They also put out two games for the Mega Modem in 1990 that both feature network multiplayer. The first was of course a Mahjong game with simple graphics, while the second was a fully featured baseball game. The Mega Modem did not see widespread support and it never left Japan. The final piece of software I want to cover is a puzzle game that had you matching tiles together to get your player to the exit. It's simple but addicting, and actually not a bad game at all. As I finish up playing all of these games, I can't help but notice the vast difference in quality of software between the stuff Sunsoft did in-house versus the stuff they outsourced to Western developers. Their early stuff looked better, played better, and most certainly sounded better. Batman had been one of their first games on the platform, yet had games coming out 5 years later that simply failed to live up to its excellence. The success of the Genesis and Mega Drive brands in the US and Europe brought forth a ton of new development studios trying their hand at making games. I believe the simple truth was, there was no replacement for experience, and the Japanese teams had been hardened into 68,000 and FM synth juggernauts thanks to their years in the arcade. It took the majority of US and European developers years to match that skill and quality of output. I believe this is in part a huge reason why the platform has such a terrible reputation for sound. Once the Japanese developers stepped away, the new blood coming in were so green with trying to get the Yamaha FM chip to sing, the end result was a heap of games that sounded nowhere as good as the games that had been released years before. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.